Admiral Yuki Hayashi stood in the airlock of the Galactic Unity Station, staring at her reflection in the polished metal door. Where her battle-scarred power armor should have been, she now wore a ridiculous ensemble that some pencil-pushing alien bureaucrat had deemed diplomatically appropriate. The flowing ceremonial robes felt like wearing a tent, and the ornate jewelry clinked with every movement like wind chimes in a hurricane. "This is what passes for military consultation attire?" she muttered, adjusting the absurd golden circlet that kept sliding down her forehead. The thing probably cost more than her entire squadron's annual ammunition budget. The airlock hissed open, revealing the grand atrium of the station. Massive crystalline structures stretched toward a dome that showed the swirling nebula beyond, and representatives from dozens of species clustered in their own little diplomatic bubbles. The air hummed with translation devices, working overtime to convert everything from subsonic whale songs to ultrasonic bat squeaks into something resembling coherent conversation. At the center of it all stood Velthanor, a being that looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a particularly uptight librarian. Its four arms moved in precise, measured gestures as it directed traffic with the kind of officious authority that made Yuki's trigger finger itch. "Admiral Hayashi!" Velthanor's voice carried the tinny quality of a universal translator struggling with enthusiasm. "How refreshing to see humanity finally embracing proper diplomatic protocols. Your previous appearances in that dreadful military hardware were quite disturbing to our more civilized delegates." Yuki smiled the kind of smile that made smart people check their exits. "Velthanor, always a pleasure. I trust the Emergency War Council is ready to address the small matter of an ancient death cult systematically exterminating entire star systems." "Ah, yes, the Devourer situation." Velthanor waved a dismissive arm, as if discussing a minor scheduling conflict. "All in due time, Admiral. First, we must observe proper ceremonial greetings. The Crystalline Collective requires exactly 47 minutes of harmonic resonance before they can participate in military discussions. The gas-form delegates need time to properly distribute their consciousness. These things cannot be rushed." A low rumble of laughter echoed across the atrium. Yuki turned to see the source, a cluster of massive reptilian beings whose scales gleamed like polished obsidian. The Skavara delegation had arrived, and they were clearly enjoying the show. War Prime Thexakai stepped forward from their group, his presence commanding attention, the way a landslide commands respect. Standing nearly 3 meters tall, with arms like tree trunks and a mouthful of teeth that could crack titanium, he embodied everything the galaxy expected from an apex predator species. His bio-armor, grown rather than manufactured, and therefore technically not armor, according to Velthanor's Byzantine regulations, rippled with each movement like liquid metal. How touching. Thexkai's voice was a bass rumble that seemed to originate from somewhere near his boots. "The little mammal has dressed up for the adults' table. Tell me, Admiral, do you plan to discuss military strategy while wearing jewelry that jingles like a child's toy?" The other Eskavara delegates hissed their amusement. It was the sound of steam escaping from a dozen pressure cookers simultaneously. Yuki's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind her eyes. "War Prime Thexkai, I see you've managed to interpret the dress code in your own creative way. That bio-armor looks remarkably functional for something that's supposedly ceremonial. The regulations clearly state that natural biological enhancements are permissible." Thexkai's lipless mouth curved in what might charitably be called a grin. "Perhaps if your species had evolved beyond wearing metal shells, you might enjoy similar advantages." Natural biological enhancements, Yuki repeated slowly, as if tasting the words. Is that what we're calling genetic modification and combat stimulants these days? The temperature in the atrium seemed to drop several degrees. Texakai's amber eyes narrowed to slits, and the chittering from his delegation took on an distinctly hostile edge. Careful, human. Your species has participated in exactly 3 major galactic conflicts. Mine has conquered 17 systems and absorbed the military doctrines of 43 different civilizations. Show respect to your betters. Betters? Yuki's laugh was sharp enough to cut glass. Funny. I don't recall the Skavara Empire volunteering for frontline duty when the Devourers first emerged. Where exactly were you when the Kepler colonies were being harvested? Thexkai's massive frame tensed, and for a moment, the predatory stillness that made his species so feared settled over him like a shroud. We were conducting strategic assessments. Unlike your people, we do not rush blindly into conflicts we cannot win. Strategic assessments? Yuki nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting way to describe hiding behind the outer rim while human fleets bought time with their lives. The entire atrium had gone quiet. Even the background hum of translation devices seemed muted, as if the machines themselves were holding their breath. Velthanor fluttered nervously between them. Please, honored delegates, perhaps we should... The human speaks of buying time, Thexakai interrupted, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the vast space. But what has your species accomplished? 3 colony fleets destroyed. The Proxima defense grid shattered. Your vaunted Earth fleet reduced to scattered survivors playing hide-and-seek in asteroid fields. He took a step closer, and Yuki had to crane her neck to maintain eye contact. You have bought nothing, Admiral. You have merely postponed the inevitable, while better species prepare actual solutions. Better species. Yuki's voice was conversational now, almost friendly. Such as the Skavara Empire, which has spent the last 6 months strategically assessing while the death toll climbs toward 1 billion souls. Acceptable losses for the greater strategic picture. The words hung in the air like a curse. Yuki felt something inside her chest grow very still and very cold. Around the atrium, delegates from species that had lost worlds to the Devourers stared at Thexakai with newfound understanding. Acceptable losses, she repeated. 1 billion people. Men, women, children. Acceptable. War requires difficult calculations, human. Perhaps if your people understood mathematics beyond simple addition, you might grasp. I understand mathematics perfectly, War Prime. Yuki's voice cut through his condescension like a blade through silk. For instance, I can calculate exactly how many Skavara fleets have engaged the Devourers in direct combat. Would you like to hear that number? Thexkai's silence spoke volumes. 0, Yuki continued helpfully. 0 Skavara fleets, 0 casualties, 0 contribution to the war effort. But please, continue explaining acceptable losses to those of us who've actually been doing the dying. You forget yourself, Admiral. Thexkai's massive claws extended slightly, a threat display that had cowed civilizations. The Skavara Empire does not answer to jumped-up primates who mistake reckless aggression for military competence. Jumped-up primates? Yuki nodded slowly, as if filing the phrase away for future reference. I'll remember that. Velthanor chose that moment to insert itself back into the conversation with all the timing of a meteorite strike. Excellent. Now that we've completed the traditional exchange of cultural perspectives, perhaps we can proceed to the ceremonial chamber? The Devourer crisis briefing is scheduled to begin in approximately 6 standard hours. 6 hours? Yuki stared at the bureaucrat in disbelief. 6 hours. While they're eating their way through the Centauri system? Protocol must be observed, Admiral. The Ethereal Collective requires 3 hours of meditative preparation before discussing matters of violence. The Silicon-based delegates need time to download the relevant cultural context files. These procedures exist for excellent reasons. Yuki looked around the atrium at the assembled delegates, beings from across the galaxy who had supposedly come together to address an existential threat. Half of them were engaged in elaborate greeting rituals that looked like interpretive dance performed by beings who had never heard music. The other half were clustered in species-specific groups, eyeing each other with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for used starship salesmen. "Of course they do," she said finally. "Wouldn't want to rush into anything as trivial as preventing galactic extinction." Thexkai's rumbling laughter followed her as she walked toward the designated human quarters. "Run along, little mammal. The adults will handle the real planning while you're busy changing into your next costume." Yuki paused at the chamber entrance and looked back at the Skvara delegation. They were already huddled together, speaking in their rapid-fire clicking language that sounded like typewriters falling downstairs. Thexkai stood at their center, his bio-armor gleaming under the artificial lights, every inch the apex predator holding court among lesser beings. "See you at the briefing, War Prime," she called out, "assuming you can spare time from your strategic assessments." As the chamber door sealed behind her, Yuki allowed herself a moment to appreciate the irony. Here she was, Admiral of the Third Fleet, veteran of the Vega campaign, and the hero of the Tau Ceti evacuation, dressed like a refugee from a diplomatic costume party, while creatures who had never fired a shot in anger questioned her species' competence. The ceremonial quarters were as ridiculous as everything else on the station, all flowing fabrics and crystalline decorations that served no functional purpose beyond demonstrating that the occupant had too much time and not enough sense. Yuki settled into a chair that seemed designed by someone who had heard chairs described but never actually seen one, and activated her personal communicator. "Admiral Hayashi to Earth Command." The response came immediately, encrypted and secure. "Go ahead, Admiral." Status report on Project Blacksmith. "On schedule, ma'am. Phase 3 trials completed successfully. Dr. Hawkins sends his compliments and asks if you need anything special for the presentation." Yuki smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Tell the good doctor that I may need his toys sooner than expected, and patch me through to Intelligence Division. I want everything we have on Skvara military deployments over the last 6 months." "Understood, Admiral. Anything else?" She looked out the chamber's viewing port at the swirling nebula beyond, where somewhere in the darkness, ancient horrors were methodically consuming everything in their path, while the galaxy's leaders debated protocol. "Yes," she said quietly. "Send a message to all fleet commanders. Operation Lighthouse is a go. Begin Phase 1 immediately." "Ma'am, that's ahead of schedule." "The schedule just changed, Commander. Hayashi out." She closed the channel and leaned back in the impossible chair, her mind already working through contingencies and possibilities. 6 hours until the briefing. 6 hours of ceremonial nonsense, while worlds burned and species died. But 6 hours was also enough time for certain preparations. Enough time to remind the galaxy that humans had not survived this long by following other people's rules. The dress code banned armor, but it said nothing about what came after the talking was done. The War Council chamber was a monument to bureaucratic excess, a circular amphitheater with crystalline walls that supposedly enhanced harmonious discourse. Yuki took her assigned seat in the human delegation section, noting with grim amusement that they'd been placed between the pacifist coalition and the contemplative order. Subtle. The past 6 hours had been productive, though not in ways Velthanor would appreciate. While other delegates engaged in ritualistic preparation ceremonies, Yuki had been in constant communication with Earth Command, Intelligence Division, and most importantly, her old friend Commander Jackson Hayes aboard the stealth frigate Shadow's Edge. "The evidence package is ready for deployment," Hayes had reported. "Our surveillance drones have been tracking Skavara fleet movements for months. The patterns are illuminating." Now, as delegates filed into the chamber with all the urgency of a funeral procession, Yuki mentally reviewed the intelligence briefing. SS Skavara fleets had indeed been conducting strategic assessments. Specifically, they'd been meeting with unmarked vessels at coordinates that made no tactical sense unless you assumed they were negotiating rather than fighting. Thexkai entered with his usual theatrical flair, his bio-armor seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. The other Skavara delegates flanked him like an honor guard, their synchronized movements speaking to military precision that was supposedly being wasted on ceremonial duties. Honored delegates. Velthanor's voice echoed through the chamber's acoustic enhancement system. "We gathered to address the Devourer crisis that has claimed 17 star systems and threatens the stability of our galactic civilization." A holographic display materialized in the center of the chamber, showing a three-dimensional map of the affected regions. Red zones marked dead systems, yellow indicated current battle zones, and a spreading web of orange showed projected Devourer expansion routes. "The situation has deteriorated significantly since our last assembly," continued a delegate from the Centauri Alliance, his tone carrying the weight of personal loss. "The Kepler colonies. There were children." "Regrettable." Thexkai's voice cut through the moment of silence like a blade. "But predictable. The human strategy of direct confrontation was always doomed to failure. Perhaps if Admiral Hayashi's forces had exercised restraint, those colonies might have been evacuated rather than defended." Yuki felt every eye in the chamber turn toward her. The accusation hung in the air like poison gas. "Interesting perspective, War Prime," she said, rising from her seat with deliberate calm. "Tell me, what would you have done differently? Assuming, of course, that you'd actually been there. A competent military commander assesses the enemy's capabilities before committing to engagement. The Devourers are clearly operating with technology beyond current galactic standards. Throwing ships at them serves no purpose beyond satisfying primitive emotional needs." Primitive emotional needs. Yuki nodded thoughtfully. "Such as protecting innocent lives? Such as refusing to acknowledge reality?" Thexkai's massive frame shifted, and his bio-armor rippled with what might have been amusement. "Your species' attachment to individual casualties prevents rational strategic thinking. The Skavara Empire has survived for millennia by understanding that some losses are acceptable in service of ultimate victory." "Ultimate victory," Yuki repeated. "And what exactly does that look like, War Prime? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks suspiciously like hiding behind asteroid fields while other species do the dying." The chamber's atmosphere grew tense enough to cut with a monofilament blade. Delegates shifted nervously, recognizing the signs of an approaching diplomatic incident. "The human questions Skavara courage?" Thexakai's voice dropped to that predatory whisper that made smart people reach for weapons they didn't have. How amusing. Perhaps Admiral Hayashi would prefer to discuss her species' tactical competence? Your Earth fleet's performance at Proxima was particularly educational. That was the moment Yuki realized she'd been played. Thexakai wasn't just arrogant. He was working from intelligence that should have been classified. The only way he could know the specific details of the Proxima engagement was if he'd had access to tactical data that Earth Command had never shared with the Galactic Council. "Educational indeed," she said quietly. "Tell me, War Prime, exactly how familiar are you with our tactical reports from Proxima?" Something flickered in Thexkai's amber eyes, a moment of calculation that lasted just long enough for Yuki to spot it. "The Eskavara Empire maintains comprehensive intelligence networks," he said carefully. "We monitor all significant military engagements." All significant engagements. Yuki smiled, and several delegates instinctively checked their exits. Even classified tactical frequencies, encrypted command channels, real-time battlefield communications that were supposedly secured by quantum encryption. The silence in the chamber was deafening. Velthanor's four arms gestured helplessly, clearly recognizing that the diplomatic situation was spiraling beyond its control. "Admiral Hayashi," the bureaucrat ventured, "perhaps we should focus on coordinated response strategies rather than—" "Oh, I think coordination is exactly what we should discuss," Yuki interrupted, her voice carrying across the amphitheater with crystal clarity. "For instance, War Prime Thexkai, would you care to explain why Skavara fleet elements were detected in the neutral zone at precisely the same coordinates where our tactical analysis suggests Devourer scouting forces have been operating?" Thexakai's bio-armor went perfectly still. Around him, the other, Iskavara delegates exchanged glances that spoke volumes about species with excellent peripheral vision and strong pack instincts. "The Eskavara Empire's fleet movements are sovereign affairs," Thexkai said finally. "We are not required to justify our strategic positioning to inferior species." Inferior species. Yuki's laugh was sharp enough to etch glass. "There's that phrase again. You seem quite fond of it, War Prime. Almost as fond as you are of being in exactly the right place to observe human fleet movements while somehow never quite managing to engage the enemy yourself." The accusation hung in the air like an unexploded warhead. Delegates from species that had lost worlds to the Devourers stared at the Skavara delegation with dawning suspicion, while representatives from the more militaristic factions began activating personal defense systems that weren't technically weapons according to Velthanor's regulations. "You accuse the Eskavara Empire of collaboration with the enemy?" Thexakai's voice was deadly quiet now. "This insult will not stand, human." "Insult?" Yuki tilted her head with mock confusion. "I haven't insulted anyone, War Prime. I've simply observed that your fleet movements coincidentally align with enemy operational patterns, that you possess classified intelligence you shouldn't have access to, and that despite commanding one of the galaxy's most powerful military forces, you've somehow avoided actually fighting the war you claim to be strategically assessing." She paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the killing blow. "Of course, if I'm wrong, there's a simple way to prove it. Ancient galactic law, Article 7, Section 3, trial by combat to resolve disputes of honor between military commanders. Winner takes all, loser. Well, the loser doesn't have to worry about their reputation anymore." The chamber erupted in shocked chittering, clicking, and harmonic resonance as delegates processed what they'd just heard. Trial by combat hadn't been invoked in over 3 centuries, but it remained valid law, older than the Galactic Council itself, and superseding all diplomatic protocols. Thexkai's massive form went absolutely motionless for a long moment. When he finally spoke, His voice carried the satisfied rumble of a predator that had just been offered exactly what it wanted. You challenge me, little mammal? You, who weighs perhaps 60 kilograms against my 300? You, whose species learned to use tools while mine was perfecting the art of conquest? I challenge you, Yuki confirmed, her voice carrying to every corner of the chamber. Single combat. Winner takes all. Unless, of course, you'd prefer to explain your intelligence sources through more traditional diplomatic channels. Thexkai's laughter was like boulders falling down a mountainside. Oh, Admiral, I accept with genuine pleasure. It has been far too long since I had the opportunity to demonstrate proper order to an upstart species. Velthanor fluttered between them in obvious panic. Honored delegates, surely we can resolve this through peaceful mediation? Perhaps a formal inquiry committee? A strongly worded resolution expressing concern? The challenge has been made and accepted, rumbled a delegate from the ancient Justicar species, beings who had served as galactic lawkeepers since before humans discovered fire. Trial by combat is invoked under Article 7. The terms must be set. Traditional rules, Thexkai said immediately. Neutral ground, primitive weapons only, survival conditions, 72 hours to hunt or be hunted. Agreed, Yuki said without hesitation. Though I suggest we add one modification. Winner takes possession of the loser's complete military records and intelligence files for historical documentation. Thexkai's amber eyes glittered with predatory anticipation. Agreed. When you are dead, human, your pathetic species will finally learn their proper place in the galactic order. When you are dead, War Prime, the galaxy will learn exactly how the Eskvara Empire has been spending its time during this war. The Justicar delegate activated an ancient ceremonial device that projected legal formulae into the chamber's air in 72 languages simultaneously. The terms are set and witnessed. Transport to the designated combat zone will commence immediately. May justice prevail. As security escorts arrived to transport the combatants, Yuki caught Velthanor's bewildered stare. "Don't worry," she told the flustered bureaucrat with a smile that belonged on a hunting shark. "I promise to observe proper dress code protocols. No armor, just like the regulations specify." What she didn't mention was that the regulations said nothing about what one could make from the bones of a defeated enemy. The transport ship Shadow's Edge materialized outside the station exactly on schedule, its stealth systems disengaging just long enough to dock. Commander Hayes stood at the airlock as Yuki boarded, his weathered face grim with concern. "Admiral, with respect, this is insane. Thexkai is a genetically enhanced killing machine with 3 times your mass and reflexes that make a viper look sluggish. He's also arrogant, overconfident, and about to learn that humans didn't climb to the top of their food chain by following other species' rules." Yuki sealed her gear bag and headed for the weapons locker. "Besides, Jackson, when did we start worrying about fair fights?" "When the fate of the galaxy started, depending on you personally strangling a space dinosaur with your bare hands." Yuki paused in her equipment selection to look at her old friend. "The fate of the galaxy depends on exposing Thexkai's collaboration with the Devourers before more species decide that surrender is better than resistance. This is just the most direct way to get that evidence. And if you're wrong about him being a traitor," Yuki's smile could have frozen. "Starfire. Then I'm about to kill an arrogant alien who called my species inferior primates and suggested that 1 billion dead civilians were acceptable losses. Either way, Jackson, I consider this a win." The combat zone was a moon designated as Sigma-7, a barren rock with extremes of temperature, terrain, and atmospheric composition specifically chosen to be equally hostile to most known species. Ancient ruins dotted the landscape, the remains of a civilization that had vanished long before the First Galactic Congress convened. As the transport ships departed, leaving two figures alone on the windswept surface, Thexkai activated his bio-armor's environmental systems and turned to face his opponent. "Last chance to withdraw, human. I will make your death quick if you beg properly." Yuki checked her primitive equipment loadout. Knives, rope, basic survival gear, and a few items that weren't technically weapons according to the rules but would serve admirably in that capacity. "Thanks for the offer, War Prime, but I think I'll pass. See you in 72 hours. She vanished into the ruins without another word, leaving Thexkai alone on the landing field with nothing but the wind and the growing certainty that he might have just made a serious mistake. Sigma-7's twin suns cast harsh, competing shadows across the ancient ruins as Yuki moved through what had once been a grand plaza. The civilization that built this place had understood defensive architecture, multiple levels, overlapping fields of fire, and enough structural complexity to make tracking a nightmare for anyone unfamiliar with urban warfare principles. Thexkai, unfortunately for him, was not unfamiliar with urban warfare principles. What he was unfamiliar with was fighting opponents who refused to behave according to established patterns. Yuki had spent the first 12 hours doing something no proper military commander would ever do. She'd run. Not tactically withdrawn, not conducted a fighting retreat, but flat out sprinted through the ruins like a marathon runner late for her own execution. Behind her, Thexkai had pursued with the methodical patience of an apex predator, his bio-armor's sensors tracking her heat signature, movement patterns, and stress indicators. What those sensors couldn't track was intent. Hour 18 found Yuki crouched in the shadow of a collapsed monument, watching Thexkai prowl through the ruins below with all the confidence of a creature that had never been prey. His bio-armor gleamed in the double sunlight, each plate perfectly calibrated for protection and intimidation. The Seskavara had spent millennia perfecting the art of looking terrifying while committing violence, and Thexkai was a masterpiece of the form, which made what happened next all the more satisfying. Yuki activated the improvised explosive device she'd constructed from her survival gear, nothing technically classified as a weapon, just basic chemical compounds that became significantly more interesting when combined with creativity and a working knowledge of exothermic reactions. The explosion wasn't large enough to seriously damage Thexakai's bio-armor, but it was perfectly positioned to bring down a section of ancient wall that had been standing for roughly 12,000 years. Physics, gravity, and several tons of architectural debris accomplished what human weapons couldn't. They knocked the War Prime flat on his considerably impressive posterior. "Acceptable losses, War Prime?" Yuki's voice echoed through the ruins as Thexkai struggled to extract himself from the rubble. "How's that for primitive tactical thinking?" His response was a roar that probably registered on seismic sensors 3 continents away. Bio-armor plates shifted and flowed as internal systems compensated for minor structural damage, and Thexakai erupted from the debris pile like a very angry, very large, and very mobile mountain. "Stand and fight, coward!" "Stand and fight?" Yuki's laughter drifted from somewhere among the upper ruins. "That's your strategic assessment? After lecturing me about the importance of proper tactics and rational thinking?" She was already moving, her smaller size and human endurance training letting her navigate the vertical terrain with an agility that Thexkai's mass simply couldn't match. The War Prime was built for overwhelming force and intimidation, not for chasing nimble opponents through obstacle courses designed by long-dead architects with a fondness for complicated geometry. Hour 36 brought the first real engagement. Thexkai had finally cornered his quarry in what appeared to be an ancient temple, its crystalline walls focusing the double sunlight into prismatic patterns that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Nowhere left to run, human. Funny thing about corners, Yuki said conversationally, stepping into view with her hands apparently empty. They work both ways. Thexkai's charge was magnificent. 300 kilograms of genetically enhanced predator moving with the fluid grace of a creature designed for killing. His bio-armor absorbed and redirected kinetic energy, his claws extended to their full lethal length, and his enhanced reflexes calculated impact trajectories with computer-like precision. What his calculations didn't account for was the fact that Yuki had spent the last 36 hours turning the temple into a carefully orchestrated death trap. The crystalline walls that created such beautiful light patterns also happened to be excellent conductors of electrical energy. The improvised capacitor Yuki had built from her basic survival equipment discharged through the temple's structure with enough voltage to power a small city for approximately 3 seconds. Thexkai's bio-armor was designed to handle energy weapons, kinetic impacts, and chemical attacks. It was not designed to handle the equivalent of being struck by lightning while standing in a pool of conductive material. The War Prime went down like a felled tree, his nervous system temporarily scrambled by several million volts of educational electricity. His bio-armor's fail-safes engaged, flooding his system with stimulants and emergency protocols, but for a crucial moment, he was vulnerable. Yuki didn't waste the opportunity. Her rope turned out to be monofilament wire capable of cutting through most known materials when properly applied. Her basic survival knife had been modified with a handle that could deliver localized electromagnetic pulses. And her emergency medical supplies included enough paralytic agents to stop a charging rhinoceros. The fight that followed would have been magnificent if anyone had been present to witness it. 2 apex predators from different evolutionary trees, each using every advantage their species had developed over millions of years of survival. Thexkai's raw strength and bio-armor against Yuki's speed, creativity, and complete willingness to ignore conventional rules of engagement. It lasted exactly 17 minutes. When the dust settled, Thexkai lay motionless among the crystalline debris, his amber eyes staring sightlessly at Sigma-7's alien sky. His bio-armor had finally failed under the combined assault of electricity, toxic compounds, and the kind of creative violence that only humans seemed capable of conceiving. Yuki knelt beside her fallen opponent, breathing hard but victorious. "Acceptable losses, War Prime," she said quietly. "How's that for a strategic assessment?" Then she began the methodical process of harvesting what she needed. SS Kavara bio-armor was grown rather than manufactured, each plate integrating with the wearer's nervous system and circulatory network. Removing it from a living SS Kavara was impossible without killing them, which was why the armor died with its host, becoming nothing more than exotic bone and cartilage. Unless, of course, one knew how to preserve the bioelectrical matrix during the separation process. Yuki's medical supplies included several items that weren't typically found in standard survival kits: molecular stabilizers, neural preservatives, and a portable bioprinter that could analyze and replicate organic structures. The kind of equipment that a forward-thinking military commander might carry if she anticipated needing to perform battlefield forensics on alien technology. Hour 68 found her putting the finishing touches on her new attire. The bone plates that had once protected Thexkai's vital organs now formed an elaborate chest piece that gleamed with their own internal luminescence. His arm guards had been reshaped into shoulder pauldrons that moved with fluid grace. The crown piece, crafted from the distinctive crest that marked him as War Prime, sat across her forehead like a diadem of victory. But the real prize wasn't the armor. It was the data crystal she'd extracted from Thexkai's neural interface, a complete record of his communications, tactical assessments, and, most importantly, his secret negotiations with entities that definitely weren't supposed to exist. The transport ship arrived precisely on schedule, its sensors confirming that only one life sign remained active on Sigma-7's surface. Commander Hayes was waiting at the airlock when Yuki boarded, his expression shifting from relief to shock as he took in her new appearance. "Admiral, is that?" "The late War Prime Thexkai. Yes." Yuki sealed the data crystal in a secure container and handed it to her communications officer. "Make sure Intelligence Division gets this immediately. Priority Alpha encryption." "And, Jackson?" "Ma'am? Send a message to all fleet commanders. Tell them Operation Lighthouse is now in Phase 2, and schedule a general assembly for all galactic delegates. I believe they'll find our next presentation illuminating." As the Shadow's Edge slipped back into stealth mode and began its journey to the Unity station, Yuki examined her reflection in the ship's polished bulkhead. The bone armor caught the light in ways that seemed almost alive, and she could feel the preserved bioelectrical matrix responding to her movements with alien grace. "Ma'am," her communications officer reported, "we're receiving priority signals from the station. It seems several more species have requested emergency council sessions. The Crystalline Collective is demanding immediate military action against the Devourers. The Pacifist Coalition is, well, they're not being very pacifist about their language regarding Skavara territorial claims." Yuki smiled, and the bone crown seemed to gleam with predatory satisfaction. "Excellent. It seems the galaxy is finally ready to have an honest conversation about this war." What she didn't say, what she kept to herself as the ship raced through the dark between stars, was that the honest conversation was going to reveal truths that would fundamentally reshape galactic civilization. The dress code still banned armor in the War Council, but it said nothing about the bones of traitors. The War Council chamber fell silent the moment Yuki stepped through the entrance. Not the polite quiet of diplomatic protocol, but the absolute stillness of predators recognizing an apex threat in their midst. She wore Thexkai's bones like a crown and shroud combined, the chest plate gleaming with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, the shoulder guards moving with liquid grace that spoke of alien engineering, and the distinctive crest of a War Prime positioned across her brow like a diadem of conquest. Every step produced a subtle harmonic resonance from the preserved biomatrix, a sound that registered on frequencies most species associated with imminent death. "Admiral Hayashi," Velthanor's voice cracked slightly as the bureaucrat struggled to process what it was seeing. "Aye, the dress code regulations clearly state that armor is banned," Yuki finished pleasantly, taking her seat in the human delegation section. "Yes, I remember." "This isn't armor, Velthanor. This is jewelry, ceremonial attire made from locally sourced materials." The remaining Siskavara delegates huddled together in their section, their earlier arrogance replaced by the kind of nervous energy that came from realizing their apex predator had been removed from the ecosystem. Other species representatives stared openly, some with horror, others with a respect that bordered on religious awe. "Where?" asked the crystalline collective's harmonic voice. Is War Prime Thexkai? Yuki gestured gracefully toward her bone crown. Present and accounted for. He sends his regrets about missing today's session, but I believe his contribution to the proceedings will be substantial. She activated a holographic projector that materialized Thexakai's data crystal evidence in the center of the chamber. What appeared was a detailed record of communications between the Essiskavara Empire and entities identified only as deep voices, conversations that made every delegate in the chamber suddenly understand why human intelligence agencies had been so interested in Siskvara fleet movements. Honored delegates, Yuki's voice carried across the chamber with crystal clarity. I present evidence of systematic collaboration between the Essiskavara Empire and the entities we know as Devourers. For the past 8 months, War Prime Thexkai has been providing tactical intelligence, fleet positions, and civilian evacuation routes to creatures dedicated to harvesting our civilizations. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of outraged chittering, harmonic discord, and what could only be described as very polite cursing in 17 different languages. The Skavara delegates tried to object, but their protests were drowned out by species that had lost entire worlds based on intelligence that should have been secure. "This is fabricated," hissed one of the surviving Skavara commanders. "Human lies designed to what?" Yuki's interruption cut through the noise like a plasma blade through tissue paper. "To distract from our species' tactical incompetence? To cover up our inability to understand proper strategy?" She smiled, and the bone armor seemed to glow brighter. "Or perhaps to excuse our primitive emotional attachment to protecting innocent lives." She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed detailed fleet coordination data. Exhibit 1, Eskavara 3rd Fleet positioned precisely to observe human defensive preparations at Kepler Colony. Exhibit 2, communication logs showing real-time updates to Devourer forces during our evacuation operations. Exhibit 3, payment records indicating technology transfers from deep voice entities to Essiskavara research facilities. The evidence was damning, comprehensive, and utterly undeniable. More importantly, it revealed the scope of the collaboration. This wasn't just one rogue war prime, but a systematic program involving multiple levels of Eskavara command. "The question," Yuki continued conversationally, "is not whether the Eskavara Empire betrayed the galactic community. The question is, how many other species thought they could cut deals with extinction itself?" That statement hit the chamber like a photon torpedo. Delegates began eyeing each other with sudden suspicion, and several species representatives activated personal defense systems with the kind of casual efficiency that suggested they'd been preparing for this moment. "However," Yuki said, raising her voice to regain attention, "I didn't request this emergency session to discuss past betrayals. I requested it to discuss present solutions." She activated a second projector, and the chamber filled with holographic displays that made every military mind present sit up and take notice. Fleet formations, weapon specifications, tactical deployment patterns, and most shocking of all, active engagement records showing human forces not just fighting the Devourers, but winning. While the galactic community has spent the last 6 months debating protocols and observing diplomatic niceties, Yuki announced, humanity has been conducting a comprehensive military campaign against Devourer forces. Operation Lighthouse has successfully engaged and destroyed 7 Devourer harvesting fleets, liberated 3 occupied systems, and captured enough alien technology to reverse engineer their primary weapon systems. The silence that followed was absolute. Delegates stared at tactical displays showing human fleets equipped with weapons that shouldn't exist, deploying in formations that suggested strategic thinking several steps ahead of anything the galactic community had imagined possible. "Impossible," whispered the ethereal collective's representative. "The Devourer's technology is beyond current understanding. Their ships operate on principles that violate known physics." "Known galactic physics," Yuki corrected with a smile that belonged on a hunting shark. "Human physicists have always been comfortable with violating the impossible. It's something of a species specialty." She activated a third display showing what appeared to be a complete Devourer vessel in human custody, its biomechanical architecture crawling with human technicians and analysis equipment. Project Blacksmith has been reverse engineering Devourer technology since the first engagement. Turns out, when you stop thinking of them as mystical ancient horrors and start treating them as a particularly sophisticated biological weapons platform, they become much more manageable. Commander Hayes appeared via secure holographic link from the bridge of what was definitely not a standard human warship. "Admiral, all fleet elements report ready for Phase 3 deployment. Dr. Hawkins sends word that the new weapon systems are performing beyond specifications." "Excellent, Commander. Initiate General. Deployment. All theater commands are weapons-free." The tactical displays updated in real time, showing human fleets emerging from stealth positions throughout the galaxy. Ships that had supposedly been destroyed or scattered revealed themselves to be very much intact and operating with technology that made the assembled delegates' most advanced vessels look like children's toys. "You see," Yuki explained to the stunned assembly, "while you were all debating whether humans were competent enough to participate in adult conversations, we were busy becoming the apex predators in this particular food chain." The crystalline collective's harmonic voice carried a note of something approaching awe. "You use the diplomatic proceedings as misdirection. We use the diplomatic proceedings to identify collaborators, study enemy tactics, and buy time for proper preparation," Yuki corrected. "The debates, the protocols, the endless ceremonial delays, all perfectly designed to let everyone reveal their true positions while we got ready for the real war." She gestured toward the bone armor she wore. "Some of you thought humans were too primitive to understand galactic politics. Others believed we were too emotional to make rational strategic decisions. A few even thought we were acceptable losses in pursuit of some greater plan." Her smile turned predatory. "You were all wrong." The tactical displays showed the reality of human preparation. Not just the weapons and ships, but the intelligence networks that had been tracking every species' communications, the economic systems that had been quietly preparing for total war production, and the diplomatic corps that had been playing a game several levels deeper than anyone realized. "The Devourers represent an existential threat to galactic civilization," Yuki announced. "But they're not invincible, they're not unstoppable, and they're certainly not inevitable. They're a military problem with a military solution." She stood, and the bone armor caught the chamber's lights in ways that seemed almost alive. "Humanity is prepared to lead a coordinated military response against the Devourer threat. We have the weapons, the tactics, and the determination to end this war decisively." Her voice carried across the chamber with absolute authority. "The question is, are you prepared to follow orders from a species you considered primitive primates?" The silence stretched for a long moment before the Justicar delegate spoke. "Admiral Hayashi, on behalf of the Galactic Council, I formally request human military leadership in the coordinated response to the Devourer crisis." "Request accepted," Yuki replied without hesitation. "All participating fleets will integrate with human command structures immediately. We have a war to win. As delegates began the frantic process of coordinating their forces with human command, Yuki allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The dress code had indeed banned armor in the War Council, but it said nothing about crowns. And as every conqueror in history had learned, sometimes you had to wear the bones of your enemies to remind everyone else who was really in charge. The galaxy was about to discover what humans could accomplish when they stopped pretending to be civilized. Epilogue: 6 months later, Admiral Yuki Hayashi stood on the bridge of the flagship Indomitable, watching the last Devourer's stronghold burn in the cold light of distant stars. Around her, the combined fleets of the galactic community maintained perfect formation, not because they'd been forced to submit, but because they'd learned to respect the species that had saved them all. She still wore Thexakai's bones, though now they served more as a reminder than a warning. The galaxy had new apex predators, and they wore the uniforms of the species everyone had once called primitive primates. The dress code, incidentally, had been permanently revised about the strength found in diversity. They were hope made manifest in fur and fang, and unshakable conviction. He'd left cubs in human care. They'd returned leading a legion of hope, all going to fight whether we want to or not. The really bad news is, our enemy doesn't believe in surrender, negotiation, or leaving survivors. Ambassador Kroon's gill slits were fluttering so rapidly they were generating small atmospheric disturbances. And the good news? Kat's smile widened, and for the first time since this whole diplomatic nightmare began, it looked genuinely warm instead of terrifying. The good news, Ambassador, is that they're about to learn why you should never underestimate a species that considers asymmetric warfare and impossible odds to be recreational activities. She gathered her materials and headed toward the exit. Briefing starts in 1 hour. Conference Room Alpha. Bring coffee. It's going to be a long war. The chamber remained silent until the massive doors sealed behind her, and then every delegate began talking at once. Outside, walking toward what was definitely not going to be her last difficult conversation of the day, Commander Kat Wolf allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Humans were officially part of the galactic community now. Time to show the universe what that really meant.